The next item of business today is a members' business debate on motion number 4421 in the name of John Mason on mergers and acquisitions. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. And with those members who wish to speak in the debate, please press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible. Mr Mason, if you're ready, 7 minutes please, if you'd like to open the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I think, as members will be aware, the focus of this motion was originally on BAE and EADS and the potential for a merger or takeover between them, and it probably is a good thing that that is now no longer to be happening. It was an interesting case, with the UK Government having a veto and the German Government strongly opposed to the merger. However, as the motion states, there was a wider aim as well, and that was to look at mergers and acquisitions policy as a whole and consider whether we are best served by the present policy we have. Firstly, I would want to say that investment generally is, of course, a good thing. It creates jobs, helps grow the economy, whether we are investing in different parts of our own country or crossing borders into other countries. Whether Scotland is independent or not, we want to encourage foreign investment here and also Scottish investment overseas. What we would not want is to repeat some of the mistakes of the past, when large grants were given to foreign firms, when the same assistance was not available to local companies. And in many cases, these foreign firms did not stay very long, and there was little benefit to the local economy. I think it was Napoleon who called England, or perhaps he was meaning Britain, a nation of shopkeepers. And of course, there's nothing wrong with being a shopkeeper. However, if the meaning of what he said was that everything is available for a price if that price is right, then it is a less positive statement. Over the years, we have seen railways, electricity and gas all sold off to the private sector, while other countries have kept these in the public sector. And in some cases we now see, for example, EDF or German railways have come back in and taken over UK businesses. So my question today is it all fine if Scottish or British businesses are taken over, either by local or international competitors? Or is there something wrong and we need to improve the present system? I think we can all think of many Scottish companies which have been taken over during the years, and one or two examples would include Scottish Power. My father worked for them all of his life, and it seemed to be a very successful company, having moved from the public sector into the private sector. Yet it was sold off to Iberdrola of Spain. Now, of course, it was a quoted company and the shareholders agreed, so in one sense that was that. And I accept that Iberdrola has made considerable investments in Scotland and beyond since that time. So it does seem on the surface, perhaps, to be a good thing. But was it really good for everybody? Was it good for Scottish consumers? Was it good for employees? Was it good for the related businesses which lost another Scottish HQ? The restaurants that lost business, the hotels that lost business, the airlines that lost business, the lawyers that lost business? Was it even good for the shareholders in the longer term? Another more recent example, Iron Brew, another very successful company, as far as most of us could see, was situated in my constituency, although they moved out to Cumbernauld. Apparently now their legal HQ is to remain in Scotland, but the operational HQ will be down south, and the combined merger with Britvic is apparently to lead to 500 job losses, with Britvic being the larger partner, having some 63% of the business. And despite the fact that Iron Brew may still be nominally a leader in that merger, the fear is that the larger partner will always tend to dominate in these things. I think it was Henry VIII who pointed out, when there was a marriage between England and Scotland's royal families and the potential for a joint monarch, that the larger would always dominate the smaller, and he, in a sense, foresaw James VI moving to London. And that were my two examples until I was watching TV last night and the report on the whisky industry and the fascinating story about that, and in particular the Guinness takeover of distillers, when the HQ of the combined company was promised to be in Scotland, and as we know, that in fact never happened. Now, of course, a lot of policy on mergers and acquisitions is now decided at an EU level, and so is not totally within the control of even the UK government. And yet my question would be, do France and Germany do better at keeping their own companies under local control than we do? Is there more loyalty by their shareholders? Do they take a longer-term view as against a shorter-term view in the UK? And are the German banks, for example, more involved in the long term for a company rather than just for the short term? But it does seem that both UK and EU policy seem to have the assumption that all mergers and acquisitions are good, except in a very, very few cases where a monopoly might be created or the whole European defence industry might be damaged. Royal Bank was the subject of a number of takeovers before eventually it grew as large as it did, and many of these were opposed in Scotland. And yet RBS takeovers were allowed eventually. Perhaps maybe they should not have been. And I think I would want to make the point at this stage that if a takeover is bad when the new company is based in London, it is probably equally bad if it's based in Edinburgh. And of course, I'm not also saying that all mergers or takeovers are bad. While I was not keen to see British Caledonian Airways taken over by British Airways in 1988, which once again killed off almost all the opposition or competition to BA in the UK, I do accept that air travel is largely an international marketplace, and primarily we should ensure there is healthy competition at that international level. I was interested in last Wednesday's Herald on the 2nd of January to see a forecast about mergers and acquisitions in 2013. And again, the assumption seemed to be that they are always a good thing, showing growth in the economy, business for certain lawyers and certain accountants. And yet the result of this free-for-all policy has been banks that are too big to fail, and now we're thinking of breaking them up. We have 4 large accountancy firms throughout the world, which means there is no real competition when, if audit goes out to tender, and very hard for medium-sized firms to break through. And we have international companies making profits which they move around the world, and we are very unclear where these profits were made. And just specifically, finally, to look at the banks, I was interested that the Institute for Public Policy Research has brought out a report complaining about lack of competition, leading to artificially high banking costs. And they say, quote, the best way to increase competition would be to break up the banks. And if they're too big now, presumably we should be trying to prevent them getting bigger in the future. So in conclusion, it seems to me that the present merger and acquisition policy, both in the UK and EU, have not been a great success. Whether we are independent or not, there needs to be improvement. But particularly in Scotland, we have to be able to start businesses, which we seem to be able to do. But once they grow, we need to keep them based here and keep headquarters here. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Hanzala Malik to be followed by Richard Lyle. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There is always a fear of job losses and an impact on indirect jobs within the supply chain where a large-scale merger is planned. However, the merger of BAE and EADS needs to be looked at in a different context. The fact that it's not going to be allowed means that there were shortcomings. I agree with the motion that we cannot assume at all mergers are good or bad without looking at the detail of each case carefully. In this case, as others, it impacts on more than just the companies involved themselves. It involves suppliers, small companies who engage with them in terms of assisting in the process. And sometimes that calculation is not clear, and therefore the job loss itself cannot be calculated in its entirety. The example cited in the motion, such as the merger of the Royal Bank of Scotland and Amro, were cases where the devil was in the detail, and in times of unstable economy, weaknesses in the system of regulating mergers and acquisitions has to be learned, and we need to learn lessons from it. I believe that the inquiry by the House of Commons Select Committee into the merger and its impact on Scottish jobs has been an important element. But I think the big threat that was perceived on the Clyde would have been the lack of contacts and uncertainty caused by the lack of defence orders, and also the threat that Scotland may leave the United Kingdom. I think we need to protect our industry from those fears, and therefore I think it is important that we ensure that Scottish firms in particular are encouraged to engage with each other rather than look elsewhere. I think also in terms of developing industry when mergers are considered, I think the government has an important role to play, even though historically we have not done so. Historically, we've allowed companies to make commercial decisions by themselves. However, when it impacts on jobs, when it impacts on the growth of industry, I then think we do have a role in which we want to play a role to assist primarily, particularly when companies go overseas and they leave all sorts of shortfalls within Scotland. And one of the examples I can cite is the wind farm manufacturing industry that we no longer have in Scotland, which means that although we may be one of the first countries in the world in terms of renewable energies, when it comes to actually the manufacturing industry, we are not up there with the manufacturing, and a lot of imports are being considered. I think we need to be in a position where we actually do exports. Without exports, we are not going to grow. Mergers, we need to have some sort of policy in Scotland in terms of what we as a Scottish government are willing to accept. And therefore, whilst I agree in principle with the motion, I do believe that we need to ensure that we support our industry more than we have done historically, and not simply rely on Scottish enterprise and others, but we as a government actually play a bigger role. We must support our industry. Without supporting that industry, we are not going to be able to support jobs and maintain those jobs. And therefore, I would request that the government actually looks at ways in which they can make a positive contribution in that area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Richard Lyle to be followed by Gavin Brown.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank John Mason for bringing forward this motion for members' debate, and I welcome the comments made by John Mason and also by Hanzala Malik and their contributions. Firstly, I think it's important for this to be a positive debate. It's often a case a merger or an acquisition is a positive for both companies and the national interest. It encourages growth in the economy and provides stability for companies involved. However, having said that, there also has been some recent high-profile cases which have brought to light some areas in the merger and the acquisition policies which may be of interest of the public to be looked at. RBS already has been mentioned, but I also like to quote the case of the merger between Lloyds TSB and the Bank of Scotland in 2008. I think that was of particular interest. Although this merger took place under exceptional circumstances at the height of the economic crisis, it was allowed to go ahead. Questions were raised as to the legality of the move, which under normal circumstances would most likely have been blocked by a competition watchdog, as the merger created a huge firm with 22 million customers. The deal was only pushed through using a national interest clause in competition law, which allowed the UK government to override any objections raised by the watchdogs. Although the deal was completed and allowed the newly merged companies to survive the worst of the economic downturn, there were serious concerns regarding if the deal delivers the best for the customers due to a lack of competition caused by the merger. And John Mason mentioned that in his contribution, the factor that banks have got bigger. More recently, the high-profile case of the proposed merger of BAE Systems and EADS has highlighted the possible need to re-examine merger and acquisition policies. In this case, David Cameron was put under pressure from a number of his own backbenchers who were concerned that the merger was not in the UK's national non-manufacturing interest. I am sure the Chamber is aware, as already has been said, that this deal fell through as the UK, French and German governments were unable to reach a compromise to suit all three nations. As I said earlier, not all mergers and acquisitions are detrimental, despite the uncertainty they bring to the workforce of the companies involved. The merger between Scottish Power and Spain's second largest electricity company, Iberdrola, has brought benefits to both companies and to the public they serve. The merger created the world's largest wind power developer, investing 25% of its business in renewables, which in turn has helped Scotland in its desire to lead the world in renewable energies. Scotland is also first in line for investment from the newly merged company, with 24% of total investment. This company will invest nearly £4 billion over the next 3 years. Despite this, I think it is important for a review of the policy in order to ensure that the best outcomes are achieved for the national and public interests, and I again thank John Mason for bringing this debate to Chamber today.
Thank you very much. Now call on Gavin Brown, after which we'll move to Minister Cabinet Secretary for closing speech.
A nice promotion there, Deputy Presiding Officer for the Cabinet Secretary. Fergus Ewing has a nice ring to it, I have to say. I had two initial observations, I have to say, when I first saw this motion. The first one was, is John Mason a man of extraordinary power and influence? Because on the 8th of October 2012, he lodged a motion casting doubt over the potential merger between BAE Systems and EADS. And days later, on the 10th of October 2012, the deal was aborted. Some say it was Angela Merkel who put the final piece into the coffin. Some say it was John Mason who had the larger influence over it. But I think, over and aside that remark, I'm slightly unsure, I have to say, as to what it is exactly Mr Mason wants to happen here. He gave us a list of a number of mergers or acquisitions that he was uncomfortable with and didn't think had been successful. I take a slightly different view from him in relation to Scottish Power and Iberdrola. I think that is a merger that has on many levels proven to be successful and enduring. He's absolutely right, of course, in relation to AOL and Time Warner, a complete corporate disaster, so bad that, of course, a demerger took place afterwards. There is now no AOL Time Warner as there once was. But I think he comes from the starting point that mergers, or I got the impression anyway, he came from the starting point that mergers and acquisitions were potentially a negative thing in the main, and also that it was more likely that UK companies or Scottish companies would be taken over as opposed to the other way around. I did have a look at the Office for National Statistics on mergers and acquisitions, just to try and get a flavour of what actually does happen out there in the marketplace. So the most recent publication came out just at the start of December last year. In quarter 3, which is obviously the most recent quarter for which they have figures, outward acquisitions or mergers, so UK companies taking over overseas companies, amounted to £7.8 billion. Inward mergers or acquisitions, so UK companies being taken over, amounted to £8.6 billion. So it was slightly more being taken over than were taking over from the UK side. But the previous year, for quarter 3, it was £6.8 billion for UK companies taking over foreign companies, £5.1 billion for UK companies being taken over by foreign companies. So I'm not sure, I'm not convinced it's all in one direction. It does seem to ebb and flow year on year. Also, in terms of bald numbers, in 2010 there were 736 mergers or acquisitions over £1 million. In 2011, 896 mergers and acquisitions over £1 million. And most of those mergers and acquisitions happen without comment. There hasn't been a degree of fallout. There haven't been negative consequences. It is a normal part. M&A activity is a normal and, I have to say, a critical part of a successful economy. So he's right to point out that there are dangers and that not every merger or acquisition is going to result successfully. But I do think the system we have is fairly robust most of the time. We have the combination of the Office of Fair Trading and the Competition Commission. The Secretary of State, of course, has limited, I stress the word limited, powers to intervene. And we also have the Takeover Panel, who are now on their 10th edition of their Takeover Code with over 300 pages, with the express interest of having orderly mergers and takeovers and protecting the offeree shareholders. So I don't think it is an entirely negative position, but of course, regardless of the system you have, there will be some mergers and acquisitions which simply don't work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on the Minister, Fergus Ewing, to close the debate, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm indebted to John Mason for bringing this topic before Parliament, and I think that John Mason set out in his speech the potential benefits, but also the potential risks which are attached to mergers and acquisitions. And I think that balanced approach is correct. The issue of merger and acquisitions is a reserved issue. It's not one, so far as I know, Presiding Officer, that has been frequently debated in this Parliament, if at all. I have obviously analysed the relevant legal provision which exists at the moment, which stems from the Enterprise Act 2002, the role of the OFT, who may investigate mergers which either meet the turnover test or the share of supply test. The turnover test is if the target company has a UK turnover exceeding 70 million. The share of supply test is met if the merging parties will supply together at least 25% of goods or services of a particular description, either in the UK as a whole or in a substantial part of it. Now, I have much more here. There's no point in me reading it out, but I thought it useful to start off from that standpoint of legal fact, because that is the sort of legal backdrop upon which these matters are considered by the UK government, and which, it's to be pointed out, has led to the failed merger talks between BAE and EADS. I think it's correct to say, and I believe this to be true, that mergers and acquisitions can, and very often do, enable the injection of significant amounts of capital into businesses. And it's undoubtedly true that businesses operating in various sectors require capital in order to succeed. It's self-evidently true that companies that make profits are better than companies that make losses, not least because the latter tend not to have good survival prospects, and therefore the stake of the customers and the employees is at risk. And therefore, well-capitalised companies are in the public interest. It is in the public interest that companies should have the capital to make the investment necessary to remain competitive and succeed globally. And therefore, I think I would say that, from my experience, which in 20 months has, I think, been not insubstantial in company visitations, that I have visited a great many companies that have benefited from investment from First of Scotland, and I think that is a good thing. The SNP has not, does not, and has never proposed to put a tartan curtain round Scotland deterring foreign investment. Just this morning, I opened the offices of UFW, a company which established an eco-hub with display of various types of renewable installations, and they brought together small businesses, and the public can go and see those installations. What a great thing. And that's a company that is not owned in Scotland. And I welcomed, on behalf of the Scottish Government, our friends from south of the border for the contribution that they are making. On a larger scale, of course, INEOS has received substantial investment from from China, and Dana Petroleum and Talisman have also received such investment. Now, my understanding of these things, and I cannot speak for these companies, is that very often such investment provides a long-term perspective, to take a longer-term view. And in sectors such as oil and gas, the scale of the investment is enormous. In refining business, the scale of the investment required is absolutely enormous as well. And I've also had the pleasure of visiting companies such as FMC Technologies and Oceaneering at their headquarters in the USA. And John Grempt, the chief executive of FMC Technology, told me that there are only 3 guys that ever come and see me: Singapore, the state of Louisiana, and Scotland. I like Scotland. He then went on to add that he wasn't a wild fan of the federal government, for reasons, Presiding Officer, which one may deduce. But nonetheless, I think there is confidence in Scotland in many sectors of the economy where we have great strengths. And that confidence comes from knowing that in this country we welcome investment. So I think it's difficult to generalise about whether mergers and acquisitions are in themselves a good thing. They are, after all, simply mechanisms and structures. What is more important is that Scotland is the best place in the world to do business. And that is what I want to be the case, and I believe that we are in many cases seen as preeminent in Scotland. Yesterday evening we had a reception for oil and gas sector which was extremely well attended, and I think the general mood was one of optimism and belief that Scotland is a good place to do business. My friend Mr Malik made a number of points. I think for the record I would have to say that I do strongly disagree with a number of his contentions. We do have wind turbine manufacturing companies with a presence in Scotland. Gaia Wind Turbines in Glasgow, as I understand it, manufactures companies, and I believe that there's also wind towers in Argyllshire that manufacture turbines. But in addition to that, we have attracted most of the large players in the world. Gamesa and Arriva, I believe, have commitments to come to Scotland, and that is welcome. These have been hard fought. These have been hard fought by Scottish Enterprise and the SDI and HIE. Every single major inward investment is a result of a huge amount of work. It cannot be otherwise. We can't expect any company to invest in Scotland just because we wish it. We have to show commitment. We have to provide the relevant support. Most companies are not looking for large cheques, in my experience. They want to know that they're coming to a country where there's a supply of labour, there's a positive attitude to work, there is a supportive government environment. Of course, there is sufficient governmental support for training, for additional costs which may arise from taking particular premises from a multitude of areas. And of course, we do our best to do that. But above all, Presiding Officer, it's the can-do attitude that companies like, and the direct access, if I may say so, that they have to myself, to the First Minister, to the Cabinet Secretary of Finance. We will move heaven and earth to attract major investment to Scotland. We do that. That is what we do every day. We provide that leadership across a whole range of sectors which are doing very well. Oil and gas, renewables, finance, the chemical industry, which doesn't receive sufficient coverage, I believe. The tourism sector doing so well that it's been singled out, as the First Minister said, by CNN as one of the best, if not the best, country to visit in the world. These things don't happen by accident. They happen because of the people involved in the business. And therefore, therefore, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, whereas I am grateful for Mr Mason to bring forward this topic in relation to mergers and acquisitions, it seems to me that the more fundamental point which we should bear in mind, and which should be the leitmotif of our policy and enterprise, is that we must continue to strive and look forward to tomorrow and not praise ourselves for what we may have had a part in achieving yesterday, to make sure that Scotland is the best place in the world to succeed in business.
Thank you very much. I now suspend this meeting of Parliament until 2:30.